The structure of financial risk did not emerge suddenly. It developed gradually over time as economic exchange expanded and uncertainty became more difficult to contain. This shift did not occur because coordination failed, but because scale increased. As participation expanded, uncertainty accumulated within the structure itself. In modern financial systems, many outcomes cannot be known in advance. Prices adjust without notice. Obligations shift over time. Assets may lose or gain value. Cash flows can weaken with little warning. For a single transaction, these changes often appear rare and disconnected. They register as isolated movements with no visible pattern linking one outcome to another. Across an entire system, the picture changes. When millions of transactions are observed together, variation appears with regular frequency. What feels irregular at the local level becomes structured when viewed at scale. Financial risk exists within this difference between localized uncertainty and system-wide regularity. As financial activity extends across markets, connections multiply over time. Transactions link distant participants, often without direct knowledge of one another. Obligations travel through intermediaries, and settlement occurs later. This distance adds layers to uncertainty as information moves at different speeds. Prices reflect partial signals. Accounts record assumptions. Contracts bind future actions without confirming future states. As these links expand, exposure spreads. No single point holds the full picture. Instead, risk is shared across positions, across durations, and across institutions. For any single connection, outcomes may appear unclear. The path from commitment to result remains incomplete. Across the network, patterns emerge. Regular flows become visible. Variations repeat within limits. What appears uncertain in isolation becomes traceable when connections are observed together. In this way, financial risk is shaped by linkage, by timing, and by the structure that holds these relationships in place. As obligations accumulate over time, records become essential. Transactions leave traces, and these traces must remain legible. Accounts preserve relationships even as participants change. Without records, commitments would fade once interaction ends. Positions would reset. Continuity would break. Within financial systems, records serve as anchors. They connect past actions to present states. They allow exposure to be observed and variation to be measured. As systems grow, the volume of records expands. Information is condensed into summaries. Detail is reduced into categories. Through this process, uncertainty is not removed. It is mapped. Risk becomes visible within limits. Patterns emerge from repetition. regularity appears through aggregation. In this way, financial risk is shaped by what is recorded, by how it is classified, and by how long those records remain active within the system. As commitments extend over longer horizons, time becomes a central factor. Decisions are made in the present, while outcomes unfold later. This separation creates intervals where conditions can change. Expectations formed at one point may no longer align with circumstances that follow. Within financial systems, time is organized. Schedules define when obligations come due. Durations separate short-term movement from longer-term exposure. Through these arrangements, uncertainty is distributed across periods. Immediate variation is distinguished from delayed effect. Losses and gains are assigned to different moments. As activity increases, these temporal layers multiply. More commitments over more intervals interact. Complexity rises. Yet the structure remains. Risk is shaped by timing, by the spacing between action and outcome, and by the methods used to track what remains unresolved as time passes. As financial activity continues to scale, mechanisms are introduced to limit exposure. Boundaries are defined within the system. Thresholds separate acceptable variation from excess. Through these limits, uncertainty is contained without being removed. Losses are constrained. Gains are bounded. Positions are adjusted as conditions shift. Within institutions, rules govern how much exposure can accumulate. Constraints shape decision paths, not by directing outcomes, but by restricting range. As interactions increase, these controls become essential. They prevent local variation from overwhelming the structure. In this way, financial risk is moderated by limits, by constraints embedded within process, and by mechanisms that slow transmission when pressure builds across the system. As pressure builds within the system, responses are triggered automatically. Adjustments occur without deliberation. Prices shift. Flows redirect. Positions rebalance. These movements do not aim to predict change. They respond to conditions already observed. Through this process, stress is redistributed. Local strain is spread across connections. Intensity is reduced by movement. Within financial systems, adaptation takes place continuously. Feedback links outcomes to future states. Signals inform subsequent activity. As conditions evolve, emphasis shifts across components. Some areas tighten, others loosen. Balance is not fixed. It is maintained through adjustment. In this way, financial risk is managed through response, through movement within constraints, and through structures that allow pressure to circulate rather than accumulate in one place. Across financial systems, risk does not stand alone. Within the overall arrangement, structure shapes the movement of exposure. Connections define the routes that variation follows. Over time, organization determines where uncertainty settles. Uncertainty moves along established paths. Variation is absorbed within defined limits. Exposure is carried on balance sheets. Institutional design holds additional portions. Time intervals separate decision from outcome. No single element contains the full effect. Instead, pressure circulates through the structure. Movement passes between arrangements built to contain it. Records preserve prior states. Constraints limit future shifts. Feedback links change to response. Financial systems maintain continuity under change. Uncertainty is not removed, it is organized. Through this organization, economic activity continues even as conditions shift and outcomes remain partially unknown. This structure does not promise stability. It establishes a framework within which variation can occur without causing the system to fragment.